Blocked from a general's funeral. A forgotten black war hero faces humiliation. This isn't a museum, Grandpa. But when the Army's top general arrives, a stunning salute will expose a hidden history and challenge the very honor of the service. The biting November wind whipped around Sergeant Major Walter Ironfoot Hayes Rhett, tugging at the threadbare fabric of his old Army dress uniform. It was a garment he'd worn with pride for occasions of solemn remembrance, each crease a testament to decades of service, each faded patch a whisper of battles fought and comrades lost. Nearly 90. His body was a frail vessel for the indomitable spirit that had earned him his moniker in the muddy trenches of Europe and the frozen hills of Korea. He'd commanded men, black men, in a segregated army, then led integrated units. His leadership colorblind even when the world around him was not. Today, he walked with a measured, slow gait, a cane his reluctant companion, toward the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. He was here to pay his final respects to General Alistair Finch, a man who had once been a fresh-faced lieutenant under his command in the early, uncertain days of the Korean War, and who was now to be interred with the highest honors. Walter's journey had begun before dawn, a series of bus transfers and a long, shuffling walk from the final stop. His old sedan had given up the ghost years ago, and a taxi was an extravagance he couldn't afford on his meager pension. As he approached the main gate, the sheer scale of the preparations was evident. Flags at half-mast snapped crisply in the wind. A sea of perfectly aligned vehicles gleamed under the gray sky, and an honor guard, their movements sharp and precise, drilled nearby. The air hummed with a somber, disciplined energy. He presented his worn veteran's ID to a young military policeman at a checkpoint. The MP, barely out of his teens, glanced at it, then at Walter's faded uniform, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he waved him through with a curt, "Proceed." Walter continued his slow march. The paved pathways of Arlington, a stark contrast to the battlefields of his youth. He was accustomed to being overlooked, a relic of a bygone era. The slights were usually subtle, a dismissive glance, an impatient sigh. He'd learned to absorb them, the way a sturdy oak absorbs the buffeting winds. His service, his sacrifices, were etched into his soul, not into the fleeting perceptions of others. As he neared the designated area for General Finch's funeral, another, more imposing checkpoint barred his way. This one was manned by a young officer, a lieutenant whose crisp new uniform and polished insignia seemed to radiate an almost aggressive newness. Lieutenant Daniels, his name tag read. He held a clipboard like a scepter, his eyes scanning the approaching attendees with an air of officious self-importance. Behind him, several senior officers, colonels, and even a one-star general stood observing the proceedings, their expressions stern and unapproachable. Walter, understanding the need for security and order at such a high-profile event, approached with a respectful nod. Before he could speak, Lieutenant Daniels' voice cut through the air, sharp and laced with an unmistakable disdain. "Hold it right there," Daniels commanded, his eyes raking over Walter's old uniform, lingering on his frayed cuffs and the slightly dulled brass of his rank insignia. Walter's skin was dark, his features etched with the map of a long, hard life, a life that Daniels, in his youthful arrogance, seemed utterly incapable of comprehending. "This is a restricted area for official guests and family of General Finch," Daniels announced, his tone amplifying for the benefit of the senior officers behind him. He made no effort to lower his voice, no attempt to show even a modicum of discretion. Walter's hand, gnarled with age, tightened on his cane. "I am Sergeant Major Walter Hayes, retired," he stated, his voice raspy but firm. "I served with General Finch. He was a friend." The word felt inadequate, a pale shadow of the bond forged in the crucible of war. Daniel smirked, a small, ugly twisting of his lips. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet still carrying, sneer, "Move it. Grandpa, this is a funeral, not a museum." The words, sharp and cruel, struck Walter with the force of a physical blow. Grandpa, museum. The casual, public humiliation was a fresh wound on old scars. He had faced down enemy fire, endured the grinding prejudice of a segregated military, buried more friends than he could count. He had earned his place in the annals of his nation's history, paid for it in sweat, blood, and the gnawing ache of memory. And now, at the gates of this sacred resting place, he was reduced to an inconvenient, antiquated spectacle, a hot flush of anger, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel so acutely in years, rose in his chest. But decades of discipline, of maintaining composure in the face of far greater provocations, held it in check. He stood straighter, his faded uniform seeming to gain a measure of its former authority. "Lieutenant," Walter said, his voice low and steady, each word carefully enunciated. "I have a right to be here. I knew the general when he was a boy, and I was his sergeant major. I taught him what it meant to lead men, what it meant to serve." Daniel scoffed, unimpressed. "Look, old-timer, I appreciate your enthusiasm for history, but we have a schedule to keep. There are important people here." He gestured vaguely towards the gathering crowd of dignitaries and high-ranking military personnel further inside. The implication was clear: Walter was not one of them. Behind Daniels, the senior officers remained silent, their faces impassive. One or two shifted uncomfortably, a slight frown creasing a brow, but none intervened. Their silence was a heavy blanket, smothering Walter's dignity as effectively as Daniels's sneering words. It was an old, familiar story, the casual disregard, the institutional inertia that allowed such indignities to occur, especially when the target was an old black man whose era of recognized valor had long since passed in the eyes of some. A few other veterans, older men like Walter, though perhaps not as advanced in age or as visibly worn by time, had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the confrontation. Whispers started to ripple through their small group. The name Iron Foot was murmured, a legendary call sign from wars half a century gone. Some of them, men who had served in Korea or even the tail end of World War II, recognized the bearing, the almost mythical status of a man who had led from the front. A black sergeant major who had commanded respect when respect for men of his race was a rare and precious commodity in the armed forces. Walter felt their eyes on him, a mixture of sympathy and a dawning, incredulous anger on his behalf. But their support was, for now, a silent current, unable to breach the wall of official indifference embodied by Lieutenant Daniels and his silent superiors. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, sir," Daniel said, his patience, if he ever possessed any, clearly exhausted. He puffed his chest out slightly, the picture of unearned authority. "Or I'll have to have you removed." Removed. From the funeral of a man he had mentored, a man whose life he had helped shape. The indignity was a bitter pill. Walter's gaze, still sharp despite his years, met Daniel's. There was no fear in it, only a profound, weary disappointment. He had fought for this country, for the ideals it proclaimed. He had seen it change, seen barriers fall. But in moments like this, the old, ugly face of prejudice, draped in the crisp uniform of a new generation, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any enemy bullet. He had survived wars, but this quiet, dismissive cruelty in a place of honor felt like a different kind of battle, one he was ill-equipped to fight with his fading strength and his obsolete uniform. He opened his mouth to speak again, to make one more stand for his right to be there, for the respect he was due. But his words were drowned out by the approaching fanfare that signaled the arrival of the main procession. The ceremony was about to begin. And Sergeant Major Walter Ironfoot Hayes, a decorated veteran, a mentor to the fallen general, was left standing outside the gate, an outcast at a hero's farewell. The humiliation was complete, public, and searing. The humiliation at Arlington's gate, sharp as it was but one of 1,000 cuts Walter Hayes had endured in his long life. His silence in the face of Lieutenant Daniels' bigotry wasn't born of weakness, but of a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. a shield forged in the fires of a lifetime spent navigating a world determined to diminish him because of the color of his skin. His stoicism was a monument to battles fought in places far more hostile than a cemetery entrance, Walter's mind. Even as the first notes of the funeral dirge reached him from beyond the gate, drifted back. He remembered the sting of the colored-only signs in his own hometown in Alabama, a bitter prelude to the separate but equal barracks he'd encounter when he enlisted in 1942. He'd joined with a heart full of the patriotic fervor that gripped the nation after Pearl Harbor, eager to fight for democracy. A concept that felt distant and aspirational even on American soil. The irony of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied basic dignities at home was a constant, bitter companion for him and his fellow black soldiers. In basic training, located in the Deep South, the treatment was often horrendous. White officers, many of whom viewed black soldiers as inherently inferior and fit only for manual labor, were quick with racial epithets and demeaning tasks. They were often given substandard equipment, poorer billets, and the constant, galling reminder that their lives were valued less. Yet, Walter, even then a young man with a ramrod spine and an unyielding gaze, found a quiet strength. He learned to swallow the bile, to channel his anger into an almost ferocious competence. If they expected him to fail, he would exceed every standard. If they thought him incapable of leadership, he would lead by undeniable example. His first taste of combat was with a segregated engineering regiment in the Italian campaign. They built bridges under fire, cleared minefields where others feared to tread, and moved supplies through treacherous terrain, often with little more than grit and determination. They were the backbone, doing the grueling, thankless work that kept the war machine moving. Yet they were largely invisible in the grand narratives of heroism. He saw brave men die, their black skin bleeding the same red as any other soldier, their sacrifices often unacknowledged, their valor unrecorded. No medals of honor were awarded to black soldiers during World War II. A silence that screamed of systemic prejudice. It was in the brutal fighting for a nameless hill in Italy that he earned the moniker Iron Foot. His platoon was pinned down, their white lieutenant green and paralyzed by fear. Walter, then a staff sergeant, rallied the men. He moved through the hail of machine gun fire as if impervious, his boots seemingly rooted to the earth with each deliberate step, organizing a counterattack, dragging wounded men to cover, his commands clear and steady above the din of battle. They took the hill, but the credit, as was often the case, went to officers who were nowhere near the front line during the critical moments. He never spoke of it, not seeking accolades that he knew would be denied. The respect of his men, the quiet nods of acknowledgement from those who knew what truly happened, was his only reward. The Korean War brought a different kind of hell, and supposedly a different kind of army. President Truman had signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the military. But orders from Washington trickled down slowly, often meeting staunch resistance from commanders KDO had spent their careers in a segregated force. In the early days of that conflict, many units, like Walter's initial infantry regiment, remained largely segregated in practice, if not on paper. The prejudice was perhaps less overt, more insidious. But it was still there in assignments, in promotions, in the way a black NCO's experience was often dismissed by younger, less seasoned white officers. He remembered a young Alastair Finch, a fresh-faced second lieutenant, arriving in Korea full of textbook knowledge, but with the deer-in-the-headlights look of a man who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Finch, to his credit, was different from many of the white officers Walter had encountered. He was willing to listen, to learn. Walter, by then a seasoned master sergeant, became Finch's shadow, his mentor, teaching him not just tactics, but how to earn the trust of the men, black and white, who would follow him into battle. He taught Finch that leadership wasn't about the color of a man's skin, but the content of his character and the strength of his resolve. There was one particularly brutal engagement near the Chosin Reservoir. The cold was a relentless enemy, as dangerous as the Chinese forces. Finch, leading a patrol, got cut off, his small contingent ambushed. It was Walter, leading a relief column of his own volition, who pushed through a blizzard and a barrage of enemy fire to reach them. He found Finch, wounded but still fighting, his men on the verge of being overrun. Walter, with the ferocity that had earned him his name, organized a fighting withdrawal, bringing back every man, living or dead. Finch never forgot it. He never forgot who had saved him, who had taught him the true meaning of courage and command through all these years. Walter Hayes had endured. He'd endured the slights, the injustices, the casual cruelties. He'd buried friends, seen dreams deferred, and hopes dashed against the rocks of institutional racism. He stayed in the Army, rising through the ranks as far as a black man in his era realistically could, not because he was blind to its faults, but because he believed in the ideal of service, and perhaps because the Army, for all its flaws, was a place where competence, under the right eyes, could sometimes transcend prejudice. He had remained silent during many provocations, not out of fear, but out of a pragmatic understanding of the battles he could win and those he could not. He chose to fight for his men, for their survival, for their dignity in the small way he could. He chose to endure the larger injustices with a stoic resolve, believing, perhaps naively at times, that a man's actions would eventually speak louder than the color of his skin. This lifetime of quiet endurance, of absorbing blows and pressing forward, was why he stood so still, so outwardly composed, as Lieutenant Daniels' words tried to strip him of his dignity at Arlington's gate. The pain was there, a deep, familiar ache, but it was an old pain, one he knew how to carry. He had faced down far worse than an arrogant lieutenant. He had faced down a world that tried to tell him he was less. His silence was the armor of a survivor. The fanfare died down, and the formal procession for General Finch began its solemn journey into the heart of Arlington. Walter Hayes remained outside the barrier, a solitary figure in his faded glory. The raw sting of Lieutenant Daniels' insults still throbbed, but the years had taught him to compartmentalize pain, to file it away and focus on the immediate. His primary objective, to honor Alistair Finch, had been thwarted at the formal entrance. But perhaps there was another way, a less conspicuous path to offer a silent farewell. He turned from the officious checkpoint, his back straight, betraying none of the turmoil within. He wouldn't give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing him defeated. He began to walk slowly along the perimeter fence, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of the cemetery. Arlington was a city of the dead, acres upon acres of white headstones standing in silent, orderly ranks. Surely, there was a quieter section, a vantage point from which he could at least see the ceremony, even if from a distance. As he walked, he was acutely aware of the eyes on him, the small group of older veterans who had witnessed his exchange with Daniels, watched him go with expressions of shared indignation and a dawning, troubled recognition. One of them, a man with a distinct Korean War veteran cap, nudged his companion. "That's him. I tell you, Ironfoot Hayes. My God, they can't be treating him like that." The whispers grew, a low murmur of disbelief and anger spreading amongst those who knew the name, or at least recognized the aura of a man who had seen too much and fought too hard to be dismissed so casually. The senior officers who had stood silently behind Lieutenant Daniels were now preoccupied with the unfolding ceremony. They had turned their backs, literally and figuratively, on the incident. It was a minor inconvenience, a trivial disturbance, already forgotten. This, Walter knew, was the insidious nature of systemic discrimination. It wasn't always the overt, snarling prejudice of a single individual. Often, it was the polite indifference, the bureaucratic inertia, the silent complicity of those in power who chose not to see, not to hear, not to act. It was the system itself, designed in ways that perpetuated exclusion, that made men like him invisible when they were no longer deemed useful or when their presence challenged comfortable narratives. His search for an alternative vantage point proved fruitless. The area around General Finch's chosen gravesite was tightly controlled, roped off for a considerable distance. Every access point seemed to be monitored. He was an old man, and the distances were considerable. His leg, the one that had taken shrapnel near the Rhine decades ago, began to ache with a dull, persistent throb, a counterpoint to the sharper ache in his heart. He found himself near a less prominent section of the cemetery, where groundskeepers were tending to the endless rows of graves. One, a man about Walter's age, though his skin was white and his clothes civilian, paused in his work, leaning on a rake. He watched Walter approach, his expression neutral. "Excuse me," Walter said, his voice quiet. "I'm trying to pay my respects to General Finch. They wouldn't let me in at the main gathering." He didn't elaborate on the reason, the shame of it still too fresh. The groundskeeper looked him up and down, taking in the old uniform. There was no malice in his eyes, but a kind of weary resignation. "Big affair. That one. Whole place is locked down tighter than a drum." "You family know," Walter admitted. "A colleague, an old friend. I was his sergeant major." The groundskeeper nodded slowly. "Lots of old soldiers here today. Some get in, some, well, depends who you know, I guess, or how sharp your uniform looks." He gestured vaguely with his chin towards the distant sounds of the ceremony. "You won't get anywhere near it from here, not without the right pass. They're real particular about these high-profile ones. Security, you know, security." Walter understood security. He had lived a life defined by it, but this felt different. This felt like a system designed not just to protect, but to exclude, to maintain a certain image. His faded uniform, a testament to long and arduous service, had become a mark against him, interpreted by the likes of Daniels as a sign of irrelevance, of being out of place. The exploitation here wasn't of his labor, as it had been in his youth, but of his very history. His service was valuable as an abstract concept, as part of the Army's proud heritage, but the living, breathing embodiment of that service, especially in the form of an elderly black man, was an inconvenience to be managed, or, preferably, ignored. He thanked the groundskeeper and turned away, the weight of his years pressing down on him more heavily than before. The covert discrimination was in the unquestioned authority of Daniels, the silent assent of his superiors, the bureaucratic maze that offered no recourse, no avenue for an old soldier to simply say goodbye to a fallen comrade. It was in the casual assumption that if he wasn't part of the gleaming, polished facade of the event, he didn't belong. As he retraced his steps, moving slowly back towards the main road, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The whispers among the other veterans had grown louder, more agitated. Some were now looking openly towards where he had been stopped, then towards the distant figures of the senior officers. A few had their phones out, not in the ghoulish way of disaster tourists, but as if considering, perhaps, documenting what they had seen. The name Ironfoot Hayes was being spoken with a new urgency, a new resonance. One veteran, a younger man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a 1st Cavalry Division patch, approached him cautiously. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice full of respect. "Are you Sergeant Major Walter Hayes, the Ironfoot Hayes from the 24th Infantry in Korea?" Walter paused, surprised to be addressed directly, and with such reverence. He looked at the man, saw the genuine concern in his eyes. "I am," he confirmed, his voice a little hoarse. The veteran's face hardened with indignation. "What they did to you back there, that lieutenant, it's a disgrace, sir, an absolute disgrace. Some of us saw it. We know who you are." More veterans were now drifting closer, forming a loose, protective circle around him. They were a motley collection of ages and service eras, their old grievances and shared bonds now focused on this single, palpable injustice. They weren't high-ranking, they didn't have the polished gleam of the Pentagon's chosen, but they were soldiers, and they recognized one of their own, a legend, being dishonored. This unexpected surge of support, of recognition, sent a flicker of warmth through Walter. For so long, he had moved through the world expecting to be overlooked, to be seen, truly seen, by these men, was a powerful antidote to the casual cruelty he had just experienced. Yet, even as they offered their support, Walter knew the limitations of their power. They were individuals. Like him, the system, the institution, was a far larger, more impersonal beast. Lieutenant Daniels, meanwhile, having successfully handled the perceived nuisance of the old black man, had returned to his duties, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips as he directed other, more acceptable guests. He was the picture of a man who believed he had done his job well, enforcing the rules, maintaining order. He was oblivious to the quiet storm brewing just a few dozen yards away, a storm sparked by his own arrogance in the deep, abiding respect that the name Ironfoot Hayes still commanded among those who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The covert discrimination had been witnessed, and the first ripples of resistance were beginning to form. Not from Walter himself, but from the ranks of his fellow soldiers. The ground, it seemed, was subtly shifting. The knot of veterans around Walter Hayes had grown from a handful to a score or more. Their faces, etched with their own histories of service and sacrifice, mirrored a collective, slow-burning anger. The initial whispers had solidified into a grim consensus. What had happened to Sergeant Major Hayes was not just an insult to a decorated soldier, but an affront to everything they believed their uniform stood for. The name Ironfoot now carried an almost reverent weight, a symbol of a legacy being trampled by ignorant arrogance. The 1st Cavalry Division veteran, whose name Walter learned was Sergeant First Class Ret. Frank Kowalski, seemed to become their de facto spokesman. Kowalski, a man with a square jaw and eyes that had seen their share of harsh realities in Desert Storm and beyond, was visibly incensed. "Sir," he said to Walter, his voice tight with controlled fury, "we're not going to let this stand. This is Arlington. This is sacred ground of it. And you, Sergeant Major Hayes, are a part of its sanctity more than that. That peacock in a new uniform." He spat the last words out with contempt, gesturing discreetly towards Lieutenant Daniels, who was still preening near the checkpoint, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering in his wake. Walter, though deeply moved by this unexpected and fervent show of solidarity, felt a familiar weariness. He had seen righteous anger before, flashes of defiance against an unyielding system. Too often, they ended in frustration, or worse, retribution for those who dared to speak out. "Son," he said, his voice raspy, placing a hand on Kowalski's arm, "I appreciate your spirit, but this is not your fight. It's an old story for me." "With all due respect, Sergeant Major," another veteran interjected, a lean, older black man wearing a Tuskegee airman cap, his eyes blazing. "It's our story too. If they can do this to you, a legend, what does that say about how they see any of us?" The sentiment rippled through the group. They were men of different wars, different backgrounds, different races, but united by a common code, a shared understanding of respect earned through service. The humiliation of Ironfoot Hayes had become a personal insult to each of them. It was then that the first act of direct, public resistance began, not with a shout, but with a quiet, determined movement. Frank Kowalski took a deep breath. "All right, listen up," he said to the assembled veterans, his voice carrying clearly. "We're going to escort Sergeant Major Hayes to pay his respects. He earned that right 1,000 times over." A murmur of agreement went through the group. There was a moment of hesitation. They were, after all, retired. They had no official standing here beyond being attendees, if they were even allowed that. Lieutenant Daniels represented the active military, the current authority, then an elderly Marine, his dress blues almost as faded as Walter's army greens, his back ramrod straight despite his years, stepped forward. "I'll walk with him. Let's see that young pup try and stop a platoon of us." This was the unexpected spark. The Marine's defiance, His willingness to create a confrontation galvanized the others. It wasn't a charge or an attack, but something far more powerful in this setting, a resolute, dignified procession of defiance. Slowly, deliberately, the veterans began to form up, not in a military formation, but as a solid, undeniable presence. They flanked Walter, Kowalski on one side, the old Marine on the other. Others fell in behind, a phalanx of weathered faces in aging uniforms, their collective gaze fixed on the checkpoint. There were no weapons, only the weight of their combined history and their shared indignation. Lieutenant Daniels, alerted by a nervous-looking MP to the approaching group, turned. His earlier smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then annoyance, as he saw not just the old man he had dismissed, but a phalanx of determined-looking veterans heading his way. His initial thought was likely that they were simply trying to force their way through again, a disorganized rabble. "I thought I made myself clear," Daniels called out, his voice attempting to regain its earlier confident bark, though a tremor of uncertainty now laced it. "This area is restricted." Frank Kowalski stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Daniels and Walter Hayes. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said, his voice dangerously calm, "you made a mistake. A big one. You're looking at Sergeant Major Walter Ironfoot Hayes. Ever hear of the 24th Infantry in Korea? Ever hear of the men who held the line when no one else would? This man isn't just a guest. Lieutenant, he's living history. And you will show him the respect he is due." Daniel's face flushed. He was being challenged, publicly, by a retired NCO, in front of his checkpoint, and potentially within earshot of the senior officers who were still somewhat visible in the distance, though now more focused on the main ceremony, which was well underway. His arrogance warred with a sudden, dawning realization that he might have misjudged the situation, that the old grandpa was perhaps more than he appeared. "I have my orders, Sergeant," Daniel snapped. Falling back on protocol, "No unauthorized personnel beyond this point." "And we have ours, Lieutenant," the old Marine growled, his voice like gravel. "Orders from a higher authority than your captain. It's called decency, respect, honor. Maybe they don't teach those in your officer candidate school anymore." Several of the veterans behind Walter murmured their assent. A low, threatening rumble. They took another collective step forward. They weren't running, they weren't shouting, they were simply walking. A wall of aged but unyielding resolve. This was the critical moment. Daniels had a choice: escalate and risk a deeply unseemly public confrontation involving a group of decorated veterans at a general's funeral, or find a way to back down without completely losing face. The MP beside him looked increasingly panicked, his hand hovering near his radio. The senior officers in the distance, though primarily engaged with the funeral, had begun to notice the unusual gathering and the tense standoff at the checkpoint. One of them, a colonel with an aide, gestured towards the commotion, a frown visible even from afar. The silent complicity was being pierced by a very public, very awkward act of resistance. Before Daniels could make his next move, before the situation could devolve into a physical confrontation or a shouting match that would disgrace the solemnity of the occasion, another unexpected element came into play, not an animal, as the AI's initial thought parameters had idly considered, but a person whose intervention was perhaps even more surprising in its quiet authority. From the edge of the official mourners area, slightly apart from the main group, but clearly a person of some standing, a woman in a sharply tailored black suit had been observing the escalating scene with growing concern. She was not in uniform, but carried an air of quiet command. She was an aide to one of the civilian dignitaries attending the funeral, and had a clear line of sight to the unfolding drama. She had recognized the name Ironfoot Hayes when it was spoken loudly by Kowalski, her father having been a historian of the Korean War. She discreetly spoke into her shoulder mic, her words inaudible to the confrontational group, but clearly directed to someone with authority. A moment later, one of the senior officers near the main ceremony, a brigadier general, looked directly towards the checkpoint, his expression suddenly alert and serious. He said something to the colonel beside him, and the colonel immediately began walking briskly towards Lieutenant Daniels and the assembled veterans. The first act of resistance, initiated by the collective conscience of the veterans and spearheaded by Kowalski and the old Marine, had successfully breached the wall of indifference. It had forced the issue into the open, making it impossible to ignore. The unexpected assistance from the civilian aide, leveraging her position to alert higher command, had ensured that the confrontation wouldn't just be a localized squabble, but something that demanded immediate attention from those who had, until now, remained silent. The power dynamic, so skewed just moments before, was beginning to tremble. The approaching colonel was a man accustomed to command, his strides purposeful, his face a mask of stern inquiry. He arrived at the tense standoff, his gaze sweeping over Lieutenant Daniels, then the formidable line of veterans, and finally settling on Walter Hayes, who stood with quiet dignity amidst his unexpected defenders. The distant sounds of the official funeral service, a chaplain's solemn words, the mournful notes of a hymn drifted over them, a surreal counterpoint to the charged atmosphere at the gate. "Lieutenant Daniels, what is the meaning of this disturbance?" the colonel demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs. His tone was not yet accusatory towards Daniels. It was the sound of a senior officer seeking to quickly ascertain and quell a disruption. Daniels, visibly relieved to see a superior officer, snapped to attention. "Sir." These individuals were attempting to bypass the security checkpoint without authorization. I informed them that this area is restricted to official guests and family. This man, he gestured towards Walter, still refusing to use his name or rank, was particularly insistent and was being disruptive. "Sir?" Daniels carefully omitted his own demeaning language, painting himself as a diligent officer merely enforcing regulations against an unruly group. Frank Kowalski stepped forward, his respectful demeanor not masking his iron will. "Colonel, with all due respect to your rank, Lieutenant Daniels is misrepresenting the situation. Grossly. He didn't just inform us. Sir, he insulted and humiliated Sergeant Major Walter Hayes, a decorated hero of 2 wars. A man who Sergeant Major Hayes, the colonel, interrupted, his brow furrowing. He looked more closely at Walter. A flicker of something, perhaps dawning recognition, or just professional curiosity in his eyes. The name Hayes combined with Sergeant Major in 2 wars was not insignificant. "Ironfoot Hayes," he asked, the question directed more to himself than anyone specific, as if dredging up a half-forgotten legend from the annals of Army lore. Before Walter could confirm, or Daniels could offer another self-serving explanation, a new presence made itself known. The hushed reverence that fell over the nearby official attendees was the first sign. Then, the distinct, measured footsteps of someone whose every movement commanded attention, from the direction of the main funeral ceremony. Walking with a deliberate, unhurried pace that nevertheless seemed to part the air before him, came a figure of immense authority. 4 stars glinted on his shoulders. General Marcus Belton, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, the highest-ranking uniformed officer in the service, was approaching. His face, known from countless news reports and official photographs, was grim. He had evidently been alerted, perhaps by the aide who had made the call, or perhaps his own attention had been drawn by the prolonged and unusual standoff. His eyes, laser-sharp, took in the scene the red-faced Lieutenant Daniels, the stern colonel, the defiant line of veterans, and at their center, the frail, elderly black man in the faded uniform. As General Belton drew nearer, his gaze fixed on Walter Hayes. The years had changed both men, but some recognitions transcend time. Belton stopped a few feet away. His eyes, which had surveyed battlefields and briefed presidents, now held a look of stunned, almost disbelieving reverence. The formidable aura of the Chief of Staff seemed to soften, replaced by something deeply personal, almost boyish. "Sergeant Major," Hayes Belton's voice was low, incredulous, but carried clearly in the sudden, absolute silence that had fallen over everyone present. Daniels, the colonel, the MPs, Kowalski, and all the veterans. Even the distant sounds of the funeral seemed to pause. Walter Hayes, who had faced down so much, felt a tremor pass through him. He recognized the man standing before him, not just as the current chief of staff, but as the scared 19-year-old private he'd taken under his wing in a godforsaken outpost in Korea. A boy he'd pushed, prodded, and protected, seeing a spark of leadership where others saw only a frightened kid. General Belton, Walter acknowledged, his voice raspy but steady. A lifetime of memories flooded his mind, of mud and cold and fear, and the unlikely bond forged between a black sergeant major and a white private from a different world. General Belton took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Walter's face. He seemed oblivious to everyone else. The power dynamic had not just flipped, it had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. Lieutenant Daniels looked as if he'd seen a ghost, his earlier arrogance melting into a puddle of terrified awe. The colonel beside him stood rigidly, a silent witness to a moment far exceeding his pay grade. Then, General Belton did something that sent a shockwave through the onlookers. He unclipped his service cap. Holding it in his hand, he took a deep breath, and then, in a voice that resonated with decades of unspoken gratitude and profound respect, he said, "Sergeant Major Walter Ironfoot Hayes, it is an honor, sir." And then, the four-star general, the chief of staff of the Army, turned his body slightly, not toward the funeral he had just left, but to face Sergeant Major Hayes more directly. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed the sharpest, most profound salute Walter Hayes had ever received. It was not the perfunctory gesture between ranks. It was the heartfelt tribute of a soldier to his mentor, to a man who had shaped his life, his career, his very understanding of duty. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind whipping through the flags. Lieutenant Daniels' face was sheet white. The undeniable evidence of his catastrophic misjudgment was standing before him, saluting the very man he had dismissed as a grandpa and a museum piece. General Belton held the salute for a long, poignant moment. Then, he lowered his hand and turned his steely gaze directly upon Lieutenant Daniels. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute command. "Lieutenant," Belton began, each word precise and devastating. "This man, Sergeant Major Walter Hayes, commanded a rifle company in Europe when your grandfather was probably still in diapers. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross on a nameless hill in Korea when your father might have been learning to walk. He taught me, Lieutenant, what it means to be a soldier when I was a scared private who didn't know which end of a rifle to point." Belton took a step closer to the now trembling Daniels. "You asked him to move it. You called this funeral a place for important people, not a museum." Belton's eyes narrowed. "You don't need to know who he is, Lieutenant, for one simple reason." His voice rose slightly, not in a shout, but with an intensity that made every person within earshot flinch. "Because if it weren't for men like Sergeant Major Hayes, there would be no us here today. There would be no army for you to wear this uniform in. There would be no ground for General Finch to be buried in with honor." He paused, letting his words sink in, the silence thick with the weight of history and the sting of rebuke. The other senior officers, including the colonel who had first approached, now looked thoroughly ashamed, their earlier silence a stark contrast to Belton's passionate defense. The civilian aide who had made the call watched with quiet satisfaction. General Belton then turned to the assembled veterans who had flanked Walter. His expression softened fractionally. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said, his voice regaining its composure but still firm. "Thank you for recognizing a hero when you see one. Thank you for standing by him." He then turned back towards the ceremonial area, his gaze sweeping over the honor guard and the other military personnel who were now watching this unprecedented scene with rapt attention. His voice boomed. The parade ground command that had directed thousands escort detail come honor guard attention. The effect was instantaneous. Every uniformed soldier within earshot snapped to rigid attention. General Belton turned once more to face Sergeant Major Walter Hayes. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice now imbued with a deep, personal warmth. "Welcome, we have been waiting for you. Forgive us for the delay." Then, raising his voice again for all to hear, General Belton issued an order that would echo in Arlington and beyond all personnel present. Arms to honor Sergeant Major Walter Ironfoot Hayes, a living foundation of the United States Army. The crack of rifles being brought to the present arms position by the honor guard was sharp and unified. Every soldier in sight, from the lowest private to the colonels and brigadier generals, rendered a salute. It was a wave of respect, a tide of honor washing away the stain of Lieutenant Daniels's earlier insult. In the midst of it all stood Walter Hayes, his frail body erect, his faded uniform seeming to shine with a renewed dignity. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. Not a tear of sadness, but of overwhelming, unexpected vindication. He slowly raised his own trembling hand in a reciprocal salute to General Belton, and then to the soldiers honoring him. The power dynamic had not just been flipped, it had been inverted, publicly, and with the undeniable evidence of a four-star general's personal testimony and a full military salute. The witnesses were many. The message was clear. Lieutenant Daniels stood frozen, a monument to his own spectacular downfall. The museum piece, now the most honored man on the field. The immediate aftermath of General Belton's commanding intervention was a study in stunned silence, broken only by the sharp click of the honor guard returning to the order arms position. Sergeant Major Walter Hayes found himself gently but firmly guided by General Belton towards the front rows of mourners, to a seat of honor that had, moments before, seemed an insurmountable distance away. Frank Kowalski and the other veterans who had formed his impromptu honor guard watched with grim satisfaction and profound respect as Ironfoot was finally given his due. They remained standing, a silent, watchful presence, ensuring the dignity of the moment was fully observed. Lieutenant Daniels, on the other hand, was a portrait of abject humiliation. His face, once flushed with arrogance, was now a sickly pale. The colonel who had initially responded to the disturbance now stood beside Daniels, his expression unreadable, but undoubtedly grim. The public dressing down by the chief of staff was a career-altering event, and not in a positive way. Justice, in this instance, was not just served, it was delivered with the precision of a drill movement and the full weight of the Army's highest authority. The funeral service for General Finch proceeded, now with an undercurrent of heightened emotion. Walter sat, his old heart aching with a mixture of grief for his departed friend and a complex swirl of vindication, gratitude, and a lingering sadness that such a confrontation had been necessary. When his turn came to pay his respects at the casket, General Belton walked with him, a four-star general acting as an honor escort for a retired sergeant major. The gesture was not lost on anyone present. It was a powerful, visual symbol of the Army's core values, a public reaffirmation that true honor is earned through sacrifice and service, not merely bestowed by rank or uniform. After the service concluded and the crowds began to disperse, General Belton spent a considerable amount of time speaking privately with Walter. They reminisced, shared stories of Finch, and spoke of the intervening years. Belton listened intently as Walter, with quiet dignity, recounted some of his experiences, not dwelling on the hardships, but on the lessons learned and the men he had served alongside. The community reaction was swift and widespread. The incident at the gate, witnessed by numerous veterans and even some civilians, quickly became the subject of intense discussion. Cell phone footage, though perhaps not capturing the entirety of Belton's intervention, certainly showed enough of the confrontation and the subsequent honors paid to Walter to paint a clear picture. Within hours, the story, often headlined with variations of General Honor's Forgotten Hero, began to ripple through veterans' social media groups and then to local news outlets. The narrative guide was compelling an elderly black war hero, disrespected by a young officer, only to be publicly vindicated and honored by the Army's top general. For Lieutenant Daniels, the consequences were immediate and severe. He was relieved of his duties at the funeral detail before the event even concluded. The colonel, under direct orders from General Belton, initiated a formal inquiry into Daniel's conduct. It wasn't just about the disrespect shown to Walter Hayes, it was about a fundamental failure of leadership, judgment, and understanding of military customs and courtesies. Daniels would face non-judicial punishment, likely under Article 15 of the UCMJ, which could include loss of rank, forfeiture of pay, and a permanent mark on his record that would effectively curtail any further career advancement. More than that, he was ordered to undergo intensive corrective training, focusing on military history, ethics, and sensitivity. Under the direct supervision of a senior NCO, the Army made it clear that his actions were not representative of its values, and that such conduct would not be tolerated. The senior officers who had stood by silently as Daniels initially berated Walter also faced scrutiny. While they weren't directly implicated in Daniels' initial outburst, their failure to intervene, to recognize a potential issue and act decisively, was noted. They received formal counseling, a stern reminder of their responsibilities as leaders to uphold dignity and respect for all service members, past and present. For Walter Hayes, the aftermath was unexpectedly transformative. He had sought only to quietly pay his respects to a friend. Instead, he became an unintentional symbol. The story of Ironfoot Hayes and General Belton's salute resonated deeply, not just within the military community, but with the wider public. It touched on themes of forgotten heroes, racial injustice, the intergenerational bonds of military service, and the enduring power of respect. Frank Kowalski and the veterans who had stood with Walter were lauded within their own circles, and by many who heard the story. They became examples of soldiers looking out for their own, of not standing idly by in the face of injustice. Their quick action had been pivotal in bringing the situation to a head and ensuring Walter wasn't simply turned away and forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Walter received letters and calls from across the country. Old comrades he hadn't heard from in decades reached out. Young soldiers wrote to express their admiration. Historians and journalists sought interviews, eager to document his life story, a story that had for too long been overlooked. The Department of the Army, spurred by General Belton's personal interest and the public impact of the Arlington incident, initiated a review of Sergeant Major Hayes' service records. It was discovered, or rather rediscovered, that commendations for his actions in both Wutbiaotlu and Korea had been recommended at the time but had never been fully processed or awarded, likely due to the pervasive racial biases of those eras. Steps were immediately taken to rectify this. A few months later, in a special ceremony at the Pentagon, hosted by General Belton himself, Sergeant Major Walter Ironfoot Hayes Reteros was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross he had earned in Korea, along with a Bronze Star with V device for valor for his actions in Italy during World War II, decades late, but no less significant. His story, once a footnote, was now etched into the official history of the U.S. Army as an example of extraordinary heroism and unwavering perseverance. The medals were pinned on his still faded but now revered uniform. Walter Hayes, the old soldier who had been dismissed as a museum piece, became a living testament to the Army's capacity for self-correction and its commitment. However belatedly, to honor all its heroes, he became a symbol of change. His experience, a catalyst for renewed conversations about race, respect, and remembrance within the military and beyond. His quiet dignity in the face of humiliation, and the thunderous affirmation of his worth by those who knew his true measure, served as an inspiring resolution to a lifetime of service marked by both profound sacrifice and persistent, subtle injustice. The system had failed him at the gate, but in the end, the integrity of individuals within that system and the undeniable weight of his own history ensured that justice and honor prevailed.